snow fell thick and heavy, blanketing the small mountain town of Evergreen in a coat of cold silence. It was Christmas Eve, and most homes were warm and bright, filled with laughter, food, and the soft glow of twinkling lights. But on the edge of town, tucked away in the dark woods, the old Mercer house sat empty and quiet. Or so it seemed. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Sarah asked, tightening her scarf as the group of friends stood at the edge of the property. Her breath came out in small puffs in the icy air. "Come on, Sarah," Jake grinned, a flashlight in hand. "It's tradition. We tell scary stories, drink some cider, and dare someone to spend the night in the Mercer house. No one's ever actually done it," said Rachel, rolling her eyes. "It's just for fun. You don't actually believe the stories, do you?" Sarah hesitated. "I don't know. What if they're true?" 50 years ago, the family who lived there vanished on Christmas Eve. No bodies were ever found, and no one could explain what happened. Some said they had left town suddenly, but others whispered darker tales, that something evil had taken them. Since then, the house stood abandoned. Locals swore they saw lights flickering in the windows at night, or heard faint music drifting from its broken-down walls. But no one dared go inside, except tonight. The group crept up the icy porch steps, the old wood creaking under their boots. Jake pushed open the front door, which groaned loudly on its rusted hinges. The inside of the house was as cold as a tomb. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung from the corners like forgotten decorations. The air smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. "See?" Jake said, shining his flashlight around. "Just an old house, nothing to be scared of." Rachel smirked, nudging Sarah. "Told you." But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows seemed to shift as the flashlight beam moved, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a ghostly footstep. "Let's do this quick," she muttered, pulling her coat tighter. The group settled in the living room, sitting in a circle on the dusty wooden floor. Jake pulled out a thermos of cider, pouring it into plastic cups for everyone. The warm drink helped ease the tension, and soon they were laughing and telling stories about ghosts, witches, and monsters. But as the hours ticked by, the house began to feel colder. The wind outside howled like a distant scream, rattling the broken shutters. The firelight from their portable lantern cast long, flickering shadows on the peeling wallpaper. "Okay," Jake said, clapping his hands together. "Time for the dare. Who's staying the night?" "No way," Rachel said quickly. "I like my bed too much." "Same here," Sarah added, glancing nervously at the dark hallway leading deeper into the house. "Guess that leaves me," Jake said with a cocky grin. "I'll do it." "You can't," Sarah said. What if something happens?" Jake laughed. "What's going to happen? The Mercer ghost will come and eat me?" Rachel chuckled, but Sarah didn't join in. The unease in her chest grew heavier. The group left Jake with the lantern, promising to pick him up at sunrise. Sarah hesitated at the door, looking back at him sitting alone in the darkened room. "Are you sure about this?" she asked softly. "Don't worry about me," Jake said, waving her off. "See you in the morning." Sarah reluctantly followed Rachel out into the snowy night, leaving Jake behind. At first, Jake felt fine. He wandered the house, poking through the remains of the Mercer family's life. Faded photographs, broken toys, and old Christmas decorations lay scattered among the dust and decay. But as the hours dragged on, the house grew quieter, the kind of silence that felt alive, pressing in on him like a heavy weight. The flickering lantern cast strange shapes on the walls, and Jake swore he saw them move. "Get a grip," he muttered to himself, sitting back down in the living room. He checked his phone. 2:13 a.m., only a few more hours to go. Then he heard it, a faint sound, like soft footsteps coming from upstairs. Jake froze. He held his breath, straining to listen. The sound came again, louder this time. It was slow and deliberate, the creak of old wood under weight. "Hello?" he called out, his voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. He grabbed the flashlight and aimed it at the staircase. The beam of light trembled as his hand shook. The footsteps stopped. Jake laughed nervously, trying to convince himself it was just the house settling, but deep down, he knew it wasn't. The air felt wrong, thick and cold like a winter grave. A loud bang shattered the silence. It came from the kitchen. Jake jumped to his feet, the flashlight trembling in his grip. "Who's there?" he shouted. The bang came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of a chair scraping across the floor. Jake edged toward the kitchen, his pulse pounding in his ears. The beam of light barely cut through the darkness, revealing only fragments of the room beyond. When he reached the doorway, he stopped. The kitchen was empty. The old wooden chairs were neatly pushed under the table, just as they had been before. Then the footsteps started again, this time coming from behind him. Jake whipped around, shining the flashlight into the living room. Nothing. Just the flickering lantern and the empty circle where his friends had been. "Okay, very funny," he said, his voice cracking. "You guys came back to mess with me, right? Ha ha, you got me. Now come out." Silence. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing all around him. Jake spun in circles, the flashlight beam darting wildly. Then he saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, standing in the far corner of the room. "Who's there?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The shadow moved. Slowly, it began to take shape. Jake's flashlight flickered, the beam dimming as the figure stepped closer. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by darkness, but its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, like dying embers. Jake stumbled backward, his heart hammering. "Stay back!" he shouted. The figure stopped. For a moment the room was deathly still, then it spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was low and hollow, like wind through a graveyard. Jake couldn't answer. His throat felt frozen, his legs like lead. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, its voice growing louder, more distorted. "This is my house, and you are not welcome." The lantern suddenly went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jake screamed, dropping the flashlight as the shadow surged toward him. When Sarah and Rachel returned the next morning, they found the Mercer house empty. Jake was gone, and so were the flashlight and lantern. The only sign he had ever been there was a single set of footprints in the snow leading away from the house and into the woods. The police searched for days, but they never found him. The only clue was a single scrap of fabric, torn from Jake's coat, snagged on the branches of a tall pine tree deep in the forest. And from that day on, the locals avoided the Mercer house even more. They said that on cold, quiet nights, you could still hear footsteps echoing through its empty halls and see the faint glow of yellow eyes watching from the shadows. But no one dared to go inside again. Not even on Christmas. For weeks, Sarah couldn't shake the events of that night. The disappearance of Jake hung over her like a shadow. Evergreen's police chalked it up to an accident. They claimed Jake had likely wandered into the forest, got lost in the snowstorm, and succumbed to the elements. But Sarah knew better. Jake wasn't the type to get scared, and he definitely wouldn't wander off without his coat or flashlight. Something else had happened in that house. Something none of the search parties, press releases, or rational explanations could account for. The nightmares started soon after. Sarah dreamed of the house, its peeling walls, the darkened corridors, and most vividly, the yellow eyes glaring at her from the corner of the room. In one nightmare, she was back in the Mercer house. She was alone this time, but she heard Jake's voice calling out, faint and strained, as if it were coming from far away. "Help me." Her blood ran cold every time she woke. By January, Sarah noticed something odd about Rachel. Her usual bold, carefree demeanor was gone. She avoided talking about Jake's disappearance and jumped at the slightest noises. She even stopped meeting up with friends, spending most of her time cooped up at home. One afternoon, Sarah decided to visit. She knocked on Rachel's door, the chill of the winter air biting at her fingers. No answer. "Rachel?" Sarah called, knocking again. She was just about to leave when the door creaked open. Rachel stood in the doorway, pale and disheveled. Her hair was a tangled mess, and dark circles hung under her eyes. But what struck Sarah most was her expression, an emptiness that chilled her more than the cold. "Sarah," Rachel mumbled, her voice monotone. "You shouldn't have come." "Rachel, what's going on? Are you okay?" Sarah asked, stepping inside. The house was dark, the curtains drawn tight. The faint smell of burnt wax filled the air, and Sarah spotted melted candles scattered across the living room. Strange symbols had been carved into the table. A shiver ran down her spine. "What is this?" she asked, motioning toward the strange carvings. Rachel shook her head, her lips trembling. "It won't leave me alone," she whispered. "I hear it at night. The footsteps. And Jake. I think I hear Jake calling me, but it's not him." Sarah's stomach nodded. "What are you talking about?" Rachel's hollow gaze met Sarah's. "It followed us, Sarah. Whatever was in that house, it came with us." Rachel refused to elaborate further, and Sarah left the house feeling unnerved. As night fell, the dread from Rachel's words clung to her. Exhausted, she crawled into bed, hoping for a night of dreamless sleep, but it didn't last long. Sometime in the dead of night, Sarah woke up to a soft, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. Her pulse quickened. It sounded like someone knocking on her bedroom window. Trembling, she turned her head toward the noise. There, through the frosted glass, she thought she saw something move, a shadow shifting just out of sight. Gripping the blanket tightly, she forced herself to breathe. "Just the wind," she whispered. "It's just the wind." The tapping stopped, but then her bedroom floor creaked. It was slow, deliberate, like someone stepping toward her bed. She froze, squeezing her eyes shut, too terrified to look. The air in the room grew cold, almost unbearable, and the faint sound of whispering filled her ears. "Help, Matt." Her heart raced as she recognized the voice. It was Jake. "No!" she screamed, bolting upright in bed. The room was empty. The air was still, but the cold remained, and her skin prickled with dread. For the rest of the night, Sarah sat curled under the covers, wide-eyed, unable to sleep. By morning, Sarah knew what she had to do. The only way to stop this, whatever it was to go back to the Mercer house. Something told her the answers lay there, waiting in the shadows. Rachel was hesitant, but Sarah convinced her they needed to finish what they'd started. "If we don't face it, it'll never stop," Sarah said. "That's what it wants," Rachel whispered, her eyes wide. "It wants us to come back." Sarah ignored her protests. That evening, armed with flashlights and a bag of supplies, they returned to the decaying house. The Mercer house was just as they'd left it, cold, silent, and oppressive. Snow had piled up against the walls, and a faint, eerie glow seemed to emanate from the second floor. "You okay?" Sarah asked Rachel as they entered. Rachel hesitated but nodded. "Let's just get this over with." They walked through the darkened halls, their flashlights sweeping over the stained wallpaper and broken furniture. Sarah felt like the house was watching them, its walls alive with something sinister. When they reached the living room, Rachel froze. There, on the floor, was Jake's flashlight. It looked untouched, lying in the exact spot he'd dropped it that night. "Jake!" Rachel suddenly shouted. Her voice echoed through the empty house. "No, don't," Sarah began, but it was too late. The room plunged into darkness. Their flashlights flickered and died, leaving them standing in silence. Then came the footsteps. The sound was unmistakable. Slow, heavy steps descending the creaking staircase. Sarah grabbed Rachel's arm, her heart hammering in her chest. "What do we do?" Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. Before Sarah could answer, the footsteps stopped, and then a voice came, deep and distorted. "You've returned. Good." A shadowy figure materialized at the bottom of the staircase. It was the same shape Sarah had seen in her nightmares, tall, thin, and cloaked in darkness. Its yellow eyes burned like twin suns, and its grin stretched unnaturally wide. "You came for him," it said, its voice slithering around them like smoke. "But he's mine now," Rachel screamed, backing away, but Sarah stood frozen, her legs refusing to move. "What do you want from us?" she managed to choke out. The figure laughed, a deep, bone-chilling sound. "You trespassed where you shouldn't have, and now you belong to me." "Take me!" Rachel cried, suddenly stepping forward. "Let her go. Just take me instead." "Rachel, no!" Sarah shouted, grabbing her arm. The shadow's eyes glowed brighter. "Very well," it hissed. "A trade." Before Sarah could stop her, Rachel was pulled into the darkness. Her screams echoed through the house, and then everything went silent. Sarah stumbled out of the Mercer house just as the first light of dawn broke over the trees. She never saw Rachel again. Days turned into weeks, and the nightmares grew worse. Sarah could still hear Jake and Rachel's voices sometimes, crying for help in the dead of night. But no matter how far she ran, she always felt the shadow of the Mercer house lurking just behind her. And every Christmas Eve, as the snow fell thick and heavy, Sarah swore she could see yellow eyes watching her from the woods. Sarah tried to rebuild her life after that horrible night, but Evergreen no longer felt like home. The memories of Jake and Rachel haunted her, and worse, something seemed to be following her. No matter how far she went or how long she stayed away, strange things kept happening. Her dreams became darker, filled with whispers and glimpses of shadowy figures. Lights flickered in her apartment, even when no bulbs were out. Objects moved on their own, keys misplaced, doors opening in the dead of night. And always, in the corners of mirrors or shadows, she caught fleeting glimpses of glowing yellow eyes. At first, she thought she was losing her mind, but by the time the next Christmas season rolled around, Sarah realized it was something far worse. The darkness had attached itself to her, and it wasn't letting go. One cold December evening, Sarah met Will, a man who had just moved to Evergreen from out of state. He was friendly, with a disarming smile and a curiosity about the town's weird old legends, including the Mercer house. "Why'd you leave that one part of town so run down?" Will asked over coffee. "I hear people are scared of it. It's cursed," Sarah replied flatly, stirring her drink. Her tone made Will pause. "You sound serious," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Because I am." As Sarah explained the legend of the Mercer family and her harrowing experience, she watched Will's confident expression falter. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, nervous but intrigued. "That's just some folklore, right?" he said. "I wish it was," Sarah muttered, glancing out the cafe window at the snow-covered streets. Despite her warnings, Will seemed curious, even eager to see the infamous house himself. "Sounds like a good spot for a paranormal investigation," he said with a laugh. "Don't go near it," Sarah said firmly, locking eyes with him. "Please, just trust me on this." The whispers started again that night. Sarah lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling as the familiar voice floated through the air. "Sarah." She bolted upright. It was Rachel's voice, clear as a bell, calling from the hallway outside her room. "Help us. We're so cold." Shaking, Sarah grabbed the flashlight by her bedside and crept toward the sound. She swung the beam of light toward the dark hallway, half expecting to see Rachel standing there. But it was empty. "Stop it," Sarah shouted into the darkness. "You're not real." The air grew frigid, and the whispering changed. Rachel's soft, pleading tone deepened into something more sinister, echoing with malice. "You let us go. You left us there." Tears streamed down Sarah's face. "I tried to save you. A sudden knock at her door shattered the moment. Sarah froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The knock came again, louder and more insistent this time. "Sarah, open up. It's Will." She ran to the door, her heart racing. When she opened it, there stood Will, pale-faced and shivering, a look of panic in his eyes. "You were right," he said, his breath coming in frantic bursts. "I saw it. Oh God, I saw it." Will stumbled into her apartment, clutching a small, weathered object in his hand. Sarah's eyes widened when she saw it, an old key. "What did you do?" she whispered. I went to the Mercer house," Will stammered. "I just wanted to look around, but then I saw Tetham." "Who?" Sarah asked, shaking him. "Jake and Rachel," Will whispered. His eyes brimmed with tears. "They were there, standing in the corner. They were trying to warn me about something. Then this shadow, it came after me. It gave me this and told me to bring it to you." He held out the key with trembling hands. It was blackened and rusted, but something about it radiated an unnatural cold. Sarah's stomach turned. "You brought that here?" Before Will could answer, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the room, sending chills down Sarah's spine. "We have to get out of here," she screamed, grabbing Will's arm. The growling deepened, echoing around them, as yellow eyes blinked to life in the shadows. A voice boomed, shaking the walls. "There is no escape." Panicked and with nowhere else to go, Sarah and Will raced through the snow-covered streets toward the Mercer house. It loomed before them like a gaping wound in the forest, its broken windows glowing faintly in the moonlight. "We have to put the key back," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "That's the only way to end this." "How do you know?" Will asked, gripping her arm. "Because it all started with that house," she snapped, pulling him toward the door. Inside, the air was colder than the wind outside. Their breath clouded in front of them as they moved through the dark, creaking halls. The growling followed them, closer and louder with every step. They reached the living room, the place where it all began. The lantern was still there, burned out and forgotten, along with Jake's flashlight. Sarah clutched the key tightly, her heart racing. "What do we do now?" Will asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Sarah could answer, the floor beneath them quaked, and the shadow appeared, taller and more menacing than ever. Its yellow eyes burned with rage, and its grin stretched impossibly wide. "You cannot undo what is already mine," it hissed. Sarah stepped forward, her hands trembling as she held out the key. "Take it back. Take your curse and leave us alone." The shadow laughed, a deep, bone-rattling sound. "You don't understand. The curse cannot end. It only spreads. And now, you are part of it." The key began to glow in Sarah's hands, burning her palms. She screamed and dropped it, but the shadow surged forward, enveloping them both in darkness. The townspeople found the Mercer house eerily silent the next morning. The door, which had hung open for years, was now tightly shut. No one dared to approach. Over time, rumors spread of new shadows appearing in the windows, joined by faint whispers carried on the wind. And on Christmas Eve, as the snow fell heavy and silent, some swore they saw 3 figures standing in the upstairs window: a man, a woman, and a tall, shadowy figure with glowing yellow eyes. The Mercer house still waits for visitors, its hunger endless, and those who enter never leave alone. After Sarah and Will disappeared, the story of the Mercer house took a darker turn. Evergreen became a town overshadowed by fear, and no one dared venture near the old property. Kids whispered, daring each other to touch the gate, but stopped short every time, chilled by the feeling of invisible eyes watching them. Strange events began to ripple outward from the house, creeping into the edges of the town. People walking their dogs near the woods claimed their pets refused to go closer, howling and pulling away as if they sensed something sinister. Others spoke of eerie carol-like humming drifting through the air on cold, still nights. The most unsettling part, though, was how the Mercer house seemed to grow more alive. The once decaying building seemed less weathered, its broken shutters hanging straighter, its shingles somehow repairing themselves. It was as if the house fed on the fear that surrounded it, drawing strength from those who spoke of its cursed hall. Despite the terror, some refused to believe. Legends, they said, were just stories, exaggerated by fear, and passed down to keep children from trouble. But the ones who dared to test that idea rarely returned unchanged, or at all. 2 years after Sarah and Will vanished, a paranormal investigation team heard of the Mercer house. The group, called Ghost Truth, prided itself on debunking urban legends. Led by Alex Carter, a sharp skeptic with a fondness for exposing hoaxes, the team arrived in Evergreen one icy December morning, their cameras and equipment packed in the back of a van. "It's just an old house," Alex said confidently to his team as they set up a base near the edge of the woods. Stories like this come from misunderstandings, wind creaking through broken walls, a little group hysteria. "We'll prove there's nothing going on here." The team consisted of 4 members: Alex, a tech wizard named Dana, a historian named Mark, and a sensitive named Ellie. Though skeptical of Ellie's feelings, Alex included her for authenticity. "That place has seen things," Ellie whispered when they first laid eyes on the house. Her breath misted in the cold air. "It's angry, hungry." "Let's stick to the facts, Ellie," Alex said, rolling his eyes. The group decided to split into pairs for the investigation. Dana and Ellie explored the lower floors, while Alex and Mark ventured upstairs. Each carried cameras, temperature sensors, and voice recorders, eager to capture evidence. In the living room, Dana noticed the dusty flashlight lying in the center of the floor. "Looks like someone left in a hurry," she murmured, picking it up. The lantern and bits of broken cups surrounded it, like artifacts frozen in time. Ellie, meanwhile, stood still, staring at the far corner of the room. "There's something here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Not a spirit, something darker." Dana shivered. Even though the air around her was cold enough already, the room temperature had dropped suddenly, far more than the outside snowstorm would explain. She noticed the flashlight in her hand felt colder than ice. "Let's go find the others," she said uneasily. Upstairs, Alex and Mark entered what appeared to be an old bedroom. The walls were stained and peeling, and a faded child's drawing hung crookedly on the wall, a stick family of 4 under a Christmas tree, labeled The Mercers. "Nice detail," Mark said, snapping a picture. But Alex frowned. The ink on the drawing seemed fresh. The colors hadn't faded like the rest of the house's decor. He rubbed his thumb across the surface, smearing the crayon. Before he could point this out, Mark called out, "Hey, check this out." In the corner of the room, a strange symbol was carved into the floor. A jagged, looping figure with a central eye in the middle. It radiated menace, even to Alex. "Looks ritualistic," Mark muttered, snapping another photo. As Alex leaned down to inspect the carving, the door slammed shut behind them. Downstairs, Dana and Ellie screamed as every light they carried went out at once. A guttural, unearthly growl rose from the walls themselves, the shadows stretching and twisting unnaturally. Ellie clutched her head, falling to her knees. "It's in the house," she whispered. "It doesn't want us here." "Who doesn't?" Dana asked, her voice trembling. "The shadow. It's alive. It doesn't just haunt the house, it is the house." Footsteps thundered above them, followed by muffled shouts from Alex and Mark. Dana grabbed Ellie's arm. "We need to find them." The two stumbled through the growing darkness, navigating by memory and the faint glow of their equipment screen. Upstairs, Alex pounded on the door, shouting at the top of his lungs. "Help! Get us out!" Mark stumbled backward, staring wide-eyed at the glowing carving on the floor. It pulsed faintly now, like a heartbeat, the central eye widening as the room's air thickened. The shadow rose from the floor, its yellow eyes burning as it emerged from the carving. It seemed to stretch, filling the room with its dreadful presence. "Why are you here?" the shadow hissed, its voice like grinding stone. Mark and Alex froze, their bravado crumbling. We're just documenting," Alex stammered, holding up his camera. "This is mine," the shadow growled. Its long, jagged grin stretched wide as it advanced. "And now you belong to me." Hours later, Ellie stumbled out of the woods alone. She was covered in scratches, her face pale as snow. The townspeople gathered around her, pressing for answers. "Where are the others?" they asked. "They're gone," Ellie whispered. Her hands trembled as she clutched a crumpled photo she had grabbed in the chaos, a black and white shot of the Mercer family. But as she stared down at the photo, her blood ran cold. The smiling family of 4 in the picture had changed. There were now 8 figures standing beneath the Christmas tree, their faces twisted in agony. The town left her alone after that. Some said she moved far away, refusing to talk about the house ever again. Others swore she was seen wandering near the woods late at night, talking to herself or to someone who wasn't there. Over time, the Mercer house became more than a local legend. Those who dared step onto the property either vanished or returned forever changed. And on Christmas Eve, the townspeople stayed indoors with their windows tightly shut, praying they wouldn't hear the faint tapping of ghostly footsteps or see those yellow eyes glowing in the dark. Because once the Mercer house chose you, there was no escape.